In short order, Russian drones ventured into Poland. Poland invoked Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO announced enhanced deployments along its eastern flank. Russian drones ventured into Poland and Romania the next day anyway, all while Russia and Belarus conducted their largest joint military exercises since 2021. Well, in light of those deterrence failures and the continuing underlying threat, some commentators have suggested that NATO countries adopt what we might call the Turkish strategy: shoot everything down the moment that it crosses into Allied airspace. It would seem to have good precedent. Turkey did this in 2015. In response, the Kremlin complained and shuffled some equipment around, but ultimately did nothing of real consequence. And perhaps more importantly for NATO's current problem, Russia did not test Turkey again. So, today, we will look back at the incident, which is full of coincidences related to the current war, to examine whether it is a template to handle Russia right now. And we will also see how a common concern that many in the West have about Russia's strategy actually has left the Kremlin vulnerable to the whole plot backfiring. The shootdown. Today, Russia is at war with Ukraine, and its air assets are finding their way over neighboring NATO countries. A decade ago, Russia was at war in Syria, and a couple of its air assets found their way over a neighboring NATO country. Yes, this was a time when Bashar al-Assad was still in power, and Russia had intervened in the Syrian civil war, in large part because Assad allowed Russia to lease the Tartus naval facility. You know how much Russia loves its warm water ports. Meanwhile, Turkey was also involved in the war, supporting one of the many rebel factions. The war itself was chaotic. So many external actors intervened that it would be easy to construct an alternate history, where Syria sparked World War III. One notable incident occurred in June 2012, when a Turkish F-4 Phantom II reconnaissance jet, like this one, was shot down in international airspace after having accidentally veered into Syrian airspace 20 minutes earlier. A few months later, Syrian artillery began shelling Turkish cities. The combination of the shootdown and the strikes resulted in Turkey invoking NATO's Article 4 clause for only the second time in history, the same Article 4 that Poland just invoked on September 10th. The Allies responded by initiating Operation Active Fence, which added thousands of soldiers to the region, and plenty of materiel to match. However, for the most part, the third parties engaged in a coordinated dance to ensure that they would not directly engage one another, only the various factions in the civil war itself. This mostly worked, but hiccups came along the way. One such hiccup was a battle in 2018, where the United States likely killed a bunch of Wagner mercenaries, the same Wagner mercenary group that would later try a Moscow mutiny. Well, another one of those hiccups occurred on November 24th, 2015, involving this exact Russian Sukhoi Su-24M bomber. It, along with one of its friends, took off from Hmeimim Air Base, just inland from Syria's Mediterranean coast, and the key hub for Russian operations in the country. You might recall that this was the same base that left Russia in a strategically vulnerable position at the end of the Syrian civil war. And you may further recall that the final offensive of the civil war could only happen because Russia was too busy dealing with its quagmire in Ukraine. But back then, bombing runs originating from Hmeimim were part of Russia's standard intervention plan, even if they could not afford higher resolution cameras at the time. As for the Turkey incident, 2 Russian bombers took off from Hmeimim at 9:24 a.m. and eventually headed northeast. Their apparent mission was to bomb rebel targets in the northwest portion of the country. Russia disputes what happened next, but I will now present Turkey's account of what happened, as submitted to the United Nations Security Council. The key is this weird segment of Turkey that juts out into Syria. The Russian bombers were traveling east to west along its latitude, but inside of Syria. Turkey was tracking the bombers on radar, and recognized that their heading would take them through Turkish airspace. At 5 minutes out, the Turkish Air Force began issuing warnings. "You are approaching Turkish airspace. Change your heading immediately." There were 10 warnings in total. However, the Russian bombers responded to none of them and continued to fly west, perhaps because Turkey was communicating on the previously agreed to 234.0 MHz channel, but a standard issue Su-24M does not have a radio that can monitor that channel. In any case, the two Su-24Ms then entered Turkish airspace. F-16s responded to the case and fired at one of them, hitting it before it had crossed back into the skies over Syria. It then crashed further west within Syrian territory. The other safely returned to Syria and landed. As for the fate of the crew of the downed aircraft, both ejected. Nonetheless, the pilot was shot and killed by Syrian rebels as he parachuted down. His body was later returned to Russia. Meanwhile, the weapons system operator parachuted to the ground safely. Russia then dispatched 2 search and rescue helicopters to find him, as well as the wreckage. Syrian rebels shot at one of those helicopters, leading to the death of an additional Russian infantryman. Everyone else, including the surviving Su-24 crewmen, returned safely. Russia eventually got parts of the wreckage returned for further examination, which included a stop at the Kremlin. The response. The immediate reactions were as you might imagine. The Russian and Turkish foreign ministers had a phone call to convey their disappointment with each other. Turkey raised the issue at NATO. The North Atlantic Council met that day. Again, this is the point of having every ally station ambassador-level representatives in Brussels. The discussion was basically a continuation of the Article 4 concerns from a few years prior that had already been reactivated 5 months earlier. Russia, meanwhile, offered a familiar response. Performative politics was the order of the day, which included bringing the flight recorder into Putin's office. There was a meeting with his defense minister on the subject. Also, as an aside, remember how conspiracy theorists at the beginning of the invasion were saying that Putin was about to die because he could not stop involuntarily shaking unless he was gripping something tightly? Well, this is a photo from that meeting with his defense minister. And here he was, grabbing a table in 2015. 10 years later, he is still not dead. Anyway, the Kremlin also held this Security Council meeting 2 days after the shootdown to formulate Russia's next policy. But for someone with a 2025 perspective, it seems like it was the same old canned response. In Putin's own words, Turkey would face serious consequences, and that Russia would never tolerate such crimes like the one committed. With those words came some minor military reshuffling. Russia sent some extra surface-to-air missile systems to Hmeimim and dispatched the Moskva to Syria's coast. None of that impacted Turkey. There were no plans to invade Syria or forcibly remove Russia from the territory, which would actually put those assets to the test. Nevertheless, perhaps the Kremlin would have been better off keeping the Moskva permanently near Syria. You may recall that Ukraine sunk it back in 2022. Meanwhile, the remaining threat the Kremlin issued was to send Turkey into economic ruin via a standard sanctions package and the termination of the Turk Stream pipeline. Okay, well, let's check in and see how that is going. Right, the Turk Stream is operational, and Russia is assisting Turkey in the construction of a nuclear power plant. As has become a tradition, the Kremlin's words were strong, but its actions did not match. A template? Given what I just described, it ought to come as no surprise that some want to use Turkey's strategy as a template for NATO's eastern flank today. After all, Ankara had a zero-tolerance policy. Russian bombers violated Turkish airspace for only a moment and paid the price. The Kremlin squeezed their tables, cried foul, and began threatening all sorts of punishments, and yet nothing serious ultimately came into effect. Perhaps more importantly, Russia made sure to stay out of Turkish airspace afterward. In contrast, Poland and Romania's responses have been soft so far. The reports vary as to exactly how many, but Poland only shot down a handful of the couple of dozen or so drones that ventured into its airspace. Worse, Romania watched as a drone breached its borders and then sat around and waited until the drone turned around and ventured back into Ukraine, presumably to continue the attack there. Understandably, the criticism is that such soft actions will only encourage Russia to continue the drone incursions. The eastern flank ought to instead put its foot down and duplicate Turkey's zero-tolerance policy. That is the only way to get Russia to stop. And really, what is the escalation risk here of merely ensuring the sanctity of your own airspace? Even broaching the possibility of escalation would first require Russia to acknowledge that these actually are Russian drones. And it is not like Russia could support getting into a serious kinetic battle with Poland anyway, not when Russia is struggling so hard in Ukraine. The final risk would seem to be Russia imposing economic sanctions. But Poland and Russia do not have much of an economic relationship anyway, so no risk, all reward. The reality. If only it were that easy. There are three major problems with trying to apply the Turkish strategy here. First is Russia's intention. It is plausible that a couple of Russian pilots made an honest mistake in 2015. Putin, not particularly pleased, but also not wanting to turn this into an actual conflict, essentially pulled an Elsa and just let it go. However, given the quantity of drones going across the border today, it is hard to classify Russia's current strategy as an accident. NATO officials are careful in ascribing intent here, but at a minimum, Russia is acting with deliberate recklessness, perhaps because its drone techs cannot program the guidance systems properly. The less generous, and more plausible interpretation, is that Russia wants to sow more discord into the Western coalition that supports Ukraine. But whatever the reason, Russia gets some kind of benefit from continuing the process, unlike was the case with Turkey. That will make the Kremlin harder to budge. Second, shootdowns are not always the safest policy. They inevitably produce debris, which could then fall on someone and kill them or destroy some property. As a result, it may be better to just let the drones fly, as long as they are heading in a direction that is less populated than where they currently are. And if there is some chance the drones will turn around and go back to Ukraine, well, then that is no longer your problem at all. Obviously, Ukraine is not happy about that perspective, but welcome to the unfair world of geopolitics. In contrast, you cannot do this with a bomber, because the bomber may be headed in a very specific direction, with a very specific payload that will be harder to destroy once released. So you need to destroy the problem at its source, which means either firing surface-to-air missiles or scrambling your fighters. The final problem is the cost ratio. When Turkey shot down the Russian bomber, someone died. A second person could have easily died as well, and there was a second bomber at stake. Never mind that a Su-24M costs about $50 million. Russia could not expect to keep doing that on a daily basis without significant political and financial difficulties. In contrast, a standard Shahed drone used to attack Ukraine might cost $50,000, and a decoy drone would be a fraction of that. In other words, we are looking at a weapon that is 3 orders of magnitude cheaper and does not put Russian airmen on the line. And yes, I get that Russia is cash-strapped and short on materiel because of the war, but Russia is producing thousands of Shaheds per month now. It can afford burning a handful of these on Poland if it wants to, and sees the benefits associated with doing that. Meanwhile, estimates vary, but just having a single F-16 in the air for an hour costs at least $8,000, and probably a lot more. And that is before accounting for whatever the F-16s use to down the drones, which is not publicly known, so I cannot estimate the cost there. We also know that Patriots are a part of the Eastern Sentry Initiative. Each one of those missiles costs $1 million. And I know I am repeating myself, but this is still not widely understood. 2 things can be true at once. 1. It is smart to use a $1 million weapon to destroy a $50,000 weapon, when the $50,000 weapon will do even more damage. 2. And simultaneously, using $1 million weapons to shoot down $50,000 weapons is not sustainable in the long run. That would only work if you had a single enemy, and an absolutely absurd military budget discrepancy, neither of which holds here. And that is the problem with adopting Turkey's strategy today. Heck, considering the weapons technology being used, Russia would love for Poland to adopt it. All of Poland's defense money would get sucked into a money drain, leaving its defenses down in other fields. Look, this is war. Sometimes a problem has no good solution. And right now, it is hard to see a way to stop Russian drones from flying into Ukrainian territory, short of destroying Russia's means to produce those drones. I mentioned before the common concern that Russia is sending drones into Allied airspace to keep NATO's defensive shields on NATO territory and stall any donations to Ukraine. But the thing is that hoarding the shields does not solve the problem. It just mitigates the problem in a cost-ineffective manner. And putting defensive shields in Ukraine does not solve the problem either, as is now being suggested. All it does is shift eastward where Europe is paying the cost. Obviously, it would be helpful for Ukraine, but the question for the day is how to solve NATO's problem, and this does not do that. Any real solution inevitably involves the destruction of Russia's drone factories. That will mean handing Ukraine long-range weapons, so at least NATO is not directly targeting Russia. Plus, this is a better counter-strategy from Ukraine's perspective, because it nips the problem in the bud. Put bluntly, if you want to reestablish deterrence with Russia, then Russia will have to take some damage. And if Russia continues to send drones into Poland, Romania, or elsewhere, then Russia will have to take even more damage. Meanwhile, you can reestablish your own geopolitical foundations with one of these 2 books on the war. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.